Hello, and welcome to the Scuttlebutt Podcast. Today, you're getting to hear my conversation with Colin Price. Colin is a 20-year aviator, was the executive officer and commanding officer of VFA 154, and is now the prospective executive officer of CVN 69, the Dwight D Eisenhower. In this conversation, we discuss what it's like being a pilot and some of the nuances of flying an aircraft hundreds of miles an hour. There's some weird similarities into driving a car. Some of the same nuances apply. We talk about the leadership philosophy he hopes to bring to the carrier life and the differences in leading at a squadron versus what he expects on a carrier with a multiple of people larger. I also get his take on the future of the Navy and when it comes to autonomous ships and AI-powered jets. Colin is incredibly passionate about the military and can be seen directly in his desire to retain people and make people's military experience positive. Colin asks that I state that any views or opinions he expresses in this podcast are his own and do not reflect the opinion of the U.S. Navy or Department of Defense. First time I've had to read a disclaimer. That's funny. Maybe that means we're onto something and finding some interesting guests. Please enjoy this conversation with Colin Price.
I've never been accused of being quiet, that's for sure.
Okay, well, here you don't have to be quiet. It's all about giving a voice. Colin, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Brock. Yeah.
I am really looking forward to our conversation. We've got a very similar, well, not similar, but an aviation background that we share. And I think we're going to have a lot of good topics to talk about there. The first thing I want to start out with talking about is having you describe what it's like being a pilot. I was leading up to this interview, I was trying to imagine what that must be like. And very simply, I have to think that it's similar to driving a car. In some ways, you're going down an area, you're being mindful of your surroundings and what else is there. And we joked on another podcast about pedals. Do you actually use pedals to operate, like the gas and the brake, or is it all hands?
Well, yeah, there are pedals, mainly, especially this what I fly the Super Hornet. You use the pedals actually to steer on the ground. So you move your rotor pedals left and right to move which way you want to turn, left or right. And then in the air, that's what controls your rudder, which controls your yaw. Now, an advanced aircraft like the Super Hornet, I'll be honest, like I'm pretty lazy with how much I use my rudders because the aircraft and the digital flight controls does everything for me. You know, back in the day with guys flying biplanes and stuff, right? You know, and even actually civilian aviators flying smaller planes really need to work their rudders to keep the aircraft balanced and flying well. So, you know, that's for the steering, but everything, you know, to go faster or slower is all with my left hand on my throttle, and to go up, down, left or right, that's all with my right hand. With my stick. You know, using the driving analogy is a pretty good one that I try and explain to people all the time, because when people see us, an aircraft flying formation and see the Blue Angels, and you know, Blue Angels is obviously an extreme example, but you know, we go out and you're taught in flight school to fly, you know, less than a foot from another aircraft. And when people hear that and you're like, wow, you're going 350 miles an hour and you're only a foot from another aircraft. And I'm like, yeah, it's no different than you doing 80 miles down the highway and you're a foot away from that car that's in the other lane from you. And then you really want to play that game where you're, you know, going to the same speed and maintaining the same kind of separation with that other vehicle. It's the same thing flying. The only difference is we add just another dimension, right? So instead of just going forward, backwards, left and right, I also got to worry about up and down. And I think sometimes that takes a little bit of the magic away from flying, because it becomes just like driving. You know, think about when you first learned to drive, got your learner's permit, there was a lot going on. It was a stressful driving at night. You know, any of that was a very stressful thing to do, and learning to fly in the beginning is very stressful, but you get to the point where, me flying an aircraft is no different than me driving to work. Now, where it gets a little, a little bit more exciting is in more dynamic maneuvering. If you're fighting with another aircraft and you're coming at, now you are pointing at each other, each flying 400 miles an hour, closing at a rapid rate, doing things like that. And then as a naval aviator, landing and taking off from an aircraft carrier have always been, even to this day, I still kind of giggle or get excited when I get to do those kind of things, just because of the quick adrenaline rush. The question I always get is people like, hey, do you like taking off or landing more? I personally have never been a huge fan of cat shots because for about 3 seconds, I'm not in control. I'm just kind of sitting back, waiting for the ride and hoping all these systems of systems all work and do their thing. Whereas like landing, I love landing because it is like the one thing in my life that I've done that's like instant gratification, instant feedback, right? Like I have just spent the last 18 seconds just focusing on flying the ball, trying to land on this moving flight deck. And as soon as you catch that wire and come to a stop, you're like, boom, I just did that. And that was always a cool feeling. So me personally, I like landing more than taking off.
Do you ever have that, you mentioned it or correlated it to driving at 80 miles an hour? I'm not exactly sure what the word is to describe this feeling, but when you're driving down the highway and then all of a sudden you kind of just like have this realization that you kind of like didn't really realize that you were driving, and you're like, oh wow, like literally if I even breathe on this wheel wrong, I could cause like a 25 car pileup, and you just like kind of start freaking out a little bit. Does that experience happen in the jet also?
All the time, right? And so, flying formation, you are just like kind of so focused and your hands are making these small little movements as you're just kind of staring at this aircraft trying to maintain that position, and you're like, what did I just do for the last 5 minutes? But because it's just, you're, as we say, you're working on brainstem power, right? And when you're driving down the road, you might not remember that 5 minutes, but at each second you were fully engaged at what you were doing at that very second, right? Like you knew you were focusing on the two lines in between you. You might have been listening to a podcast or rocking out to whatever song you are, right? But you were focusing on for that second. It just kind of blurs together. And the flying's the same way. Each second I'm in fully focused, but then the last group of seconds just kind of start blurring together, and I can't really pick out a particular moment as I'm flying. But yes, I do that both driving and flying all the time.
That doesn't surprise me to hear. When it comes to the arrestments on a carrier and like takeoffs, I've read some certain things about this, but I've never really gotten a clear answer. Is there a certain degradation that happens to your body from experiencing that? Because I had the actual great pleasure of taking a COD plane off and onto a carrier at a specific time, and got to feel that launch feeling. Obviously not quite as fast, I'm sure, but the feeling of the launch and then the arrestment. And I can't imagine that that's super great on your body. Is there a limit or a number of times that they look at that, at least from a medical perspective?
No, so I mean, it's all individual based. I will tell you, like, I have arthritis in my neck, and especially from cat shots, because if you go on YouTube and you watch a video, there's always a kind of video of it's facing the pilot as he's going down the cat stroke, and as kind of you hit the end of the carrier and that pressure comes off, there's a tendency for your head to snap forward. And I spent a lot of my career wearing what we call the joint helmet mounted Kuhn system, which is kind of the big visor, and it's a big bulky device on the top that allows me to do a lot of my sensor operation and inputs through my helmet. It's a great piece of gear, but it weighs a lot, and that you've got this huge weight on the fulcrum of your head that kind of snaps forward, and it doesn't seem like much, but after and I've got just over 700 arrestments and catapults off a carrier, that starts adding up. And when I was leaving Japan about 2014 off of my department head tour, I almost took non-flying orders because my neck was kind of locking up about, every couple weeks, I got an appointment with a physical therapist tomorrow to do it. And it's kind of one of those things that I think we need to do a better job, and we're getting there. Is we do have physical therapists on base. We're trying to get people there, but it's also just teaching aviators on day one on neck and back care, because those are the two most common problems that we see. Helicopter pilots, they do a lot of they have their backs take a lot of beating. As aviators, we take a lot of beating on our neck, especially if you're trying to pull G's and you're fighting a guy and you're trying to look over your shoulder to find him, and now you're pulling G's as you're moving your head. So now instead of my human head weighs 8 pounds or what it was from Jerry Maguire, now I'm pulling 4 or 5 G's. Now that's 40 or 50 pounds of strain that my neck's not designed to take. And just teaching aviators to kind of like, hey, move your head, pull G, and then get your head set, and then kind of get on the G, teaching things like that. But also just day-to-day maintenance and strengthening, something I'm constantly striving to do as well. But now I'm behind the power curve, right? Like the damage is done to my neck. I'm fully mobile, I can still fly, it's not a big deal. I just can't, I don't have as much neck magic as I used to. As I tell people, I can't fully look as back. So the way I fight the aircraft has actually changed a little bit because of the way I move my neck. So yeah, over time, it's flying an aircraft, especially a high performance aircraft. It's a rough sport. It will take the toll on you. Pulling G's, arrestments, and cat shots all start adding up after a while if you're not kind of physically fit and ready for it.
Can't be losing that neck magic, as you said. For anybody unfamiliar, would you explain pulling G's just so that we're appealing to non-aviation folks?
Yeah, no problem. You're gonna keep me honest on some things I take for granted, right? So when we're sitting here on the ground, or you're flying straight and level in an aircraft, your one gravitational unit is what is pulling you towards the earth. But as we move an aircraft, are changing how much lift we're pulling, and that would change how fast we turn. So if you're in an airline, or even when they do a 30-degree angle of bank, they actually have to pull a little bit more G with that angle of bank. You just don't feel it because it's like goes from like 1 G to like 1.1 G, because we have to kind of make sure the lift vector, the lift keeping the airplane going vertical, is still there. But for us in a high performance aircraft, Super Hornet was 7.5 Gs. I have some time in the F-16, which we could pull 9 Gs. So you're pulling 7.5 to 9 times the normal weight of gravity. So for a guy like me who weighs 225 pounds, I'm not going to try and do public math, but now as I'm pulling 7 Gs, 7 times 225 is kind of like how much I'm actually like kind of weighing as we pull. And that's why you're able to see any sort of military jet aircraft, really turn quickly or whatever, because they're pulling G to increase that lift and move their nose quicker through the sky.
I can tell already just from our brief conversation that you live and breathe this, just in the way that you talk, because even before this, you're throwing out words like fulcrum and your pitch and your yaw. You're like very tuned into kind of like the dynamics and the verbiage used in that. That's funny.
Yeah, so it's a little bit of my engineering brain working too, as now I've been living in the nuclear world for the last year. I think mathematically a lot more, but I've been doing this for 20 years, and I've been fortunate that in my 20 years up to this point, like I was flying the entire time. Like I got to be in constantly flying in an aircraft. So it has been my consistent conversation that I've been having for the last 20 years.
Yeah, you've made a life of it, and that's absolutely what you know. How old were you when you joined?
So I got into the Naval Academy out of high school. So I went into the Naval Academy at 18, did my 4 years there, and graduated in 2001. So I was, just turned 22 when I actually was commissioned as an ensign, and went down to Pensacola to kind of start my career path as a naval aviator.
You mentioned you've been in nuclear power school, spent 20 years flying. You're actually slotted to take over as the XO of a carrier, CVN 69, Dwight D Eisenhower. One, congratulations. Like, that is a magnificent honor, like just as a third party, but also very prestigious within the Navy, just because there's one, so few carriers. And I mean, there's not a ton of pilots, but there's quite a few. And we were talking before, you were explaining how you actually need to be a pilot to take, or an NFO, naval flight officer, to take over command of a carrier. Are you excited? Are you nervous? What's going through your head?
Both. Yeah, I'm definitely excited. Like, this has been a long time coming to get to this path. One of which, for most of my career, I was definitely the guy who was like, no way, I'm not going to do that. That sounds ridiculous. And then, here I am now. I'm definitely excited because, especially I've been in school for the last year. So I'm you get to the point where, like, all right, I'm done with school. Like, I just want to get in and actually do things, get in and act instead of just kind of like learning. But trading that off of is, so the last 20 years, what I tell people is when I joined my squadron, so prior to this, I was the executive officer, commanding officer, BFA 154 in Lemoore, California. And when I stepped in as an executive officer, I had been living and breathing squadron operations for 18 years to that point. Like, I knew exactly what I needed to do the day I stepped in. Like, I knew what a squadron was supposed to do, how people were supposed to act, how things were supposed to get done. I wasn't worried about that. There's going to be a couple things that I had to kind of learn along the way, but for the most part, it's like, hey, I know how to do this job. But like any self-respecting aviator, is when you get on the carrier, what people don't realize is, you hear the number of the carrier is 5,000 people. Well, 3,500 of that is the people who are actually attached and to the carrier. The other 1,500 is the air wing. So that's all the airplanes that come on board when we go on deployment. We are two separate entities, and we do some training as we get ready to go on deployment. But like I said, we're two separate. And so as when you get on, when you're an air wing person, i.e. you're in a squadron, you get on a carrier, like, that's carrier people doing carrier stuff. I'm over here on the flight deck doing my thing. And we live on the, what we call the O3 level, which is the if you look at kind of the vertical floors of a ship, we label we call them decks. And then above the hangar deck is the O3 level. That's one right below the flight deck. And like, I lived on the O3 level. That's where the ready room, where I briefed and worked every day. I could eat up there. I mean, there was a gym up there. I could live my entire life just on the O3 level and then step up on the flight deck to go flying. That's all I needed to do. But there's a ton of other things that go on below that O3 level on an aircraft carrier that I have never experienced and don't know. And there's so many other jobs. And that's the part that makes me nervous. Or a little anxious, is like, there's a lot that makes an aircraft carrier. It is a mini city with everyone doing everything, and I've got to learn every single one of those jobs and what those people do and what makes them tick, and how we get this all kind of going in the same direction. I mean, the ultimate goal is an aircraft going off the front end with ordnance to do whatever the mission takes, right? Like, all that 5,000 people, their entire goal is to make sure that aircraft gets off safely and is able to do its job. So there's a lot for me to learn. I am out of my comfort level, but is one of the reasons I chose to kind of pursue this task was I like to get out of my comfort level, and this was the best way to do it.
Yeah, I can confidently say and speak to the level of how much is going on a carrier. I spent 2.5 years on one, lived on one for over a year, and I still did not visit all of the spaces that the boat has. So there really is a lot that it takes to keep it moving. I was going to ask, you mentioned that you wanted to pursue this. How do you decide that? And is that something that's almost maybe decided for you? Do you come and get the tap on the shoulder and they say, hey, you might be a good person for this? Or is that something relatively available to everybody?
So both. And really, this is, I think you're probably familiar with the Navy, right? In the Navy, you can always kind of ask for what you want. And then, as my buddy says, like, hey, if your wants aligns with the Navy's needs, you're always going to get your first choice. That's not necessarily the case. So, so this case, to be eligible for this pipeline, what we call the nuke pipeline in our community, you have to have done a successful squadron command. So I, was fortunate that I had a good command, and was able to come out of that. And there's a point where your boss pulls you in, and especially for my boss, and I was getting ready to retire or thinking about retiring prior to this, and my boss kind of pulled me in. He kind of gave me the, hey, are you in or you're out? And of course, this was like month 1 of deployment, and another life lesson is never make life decisions on deployment. But my wife and I had discussed about it. But I said, hey, I think this is now something I'm interested in. And then ultimately, there's the Navy has what we call screen board. So everyone that's kind of eligible, your record gets looked at in Millington, Tennessee, and then they select the people that they think are the best suited. So there are some requirements. There were some academic requirements for us to be able to pursue this path. So it was something. Yes, I was like, hey, I want to do this, but ultimately the Navy had to kind of pick me and say, yep, hey, we think you're capable of doing this, and so I got selected for it.
How do you look at your commitment going forward when you're saying you're being asked, like, are you in or are you out? Are you looking at this as, is this just another couple of years you're adding on and then you're going to see how it goes? Or is this like, no, we're going to do this and go all the way?
Yeah, that
I don't know what
somewhat
all
of
the way
a
is.
loaded question, but it's a fair question, because that's one of the things that really scares people off about this pipeline, is that really from start to finish, it's about 8 years before you're even when you finish potentially being the commanding officer of an aircraft carrier. And let me give you a little background. The background. So I've already been in for 20 years, right? I had to do kind of 3 operational tours and squadrons to even get to this point. And then once you get selected for this pipeline, you do about 18 months of training, the majority of which is going through kind of nuclear power training. That's 18 months. Then you do 18 to 24 months as what we call the big XO, or the executive officer of an aircraft carrier. There's a bunch of other executive officers. Like I was an executive officer on an aircraft carrier of a squadron, but the big XO is the one to rule them all. It's what he does or she does. And then after that, you can go or do what we call a deep draft command. So kind of a large amphibious ship. Do that for 14 to 15 months. And then after that, you're now again have to get actually selected to get looked at to command an aircraft carrier, right? That's not a given. And then if you're a CO of an aircraft carrier, that's anywhere from, probably about 30 to 30 to 36 months, right? So start to finish, it's about 8 years. Now, that being said, at no time I have not signed the dotted line that says, yes, I'm in for the next 8 years. But there's a little bit of I've come this far, like, I can't quit now. So, going back, I think the important part is like, yeah, I was thinking about retiring. I was hitting my 20 and I was going to be current in an aircraft. So if I was thinking about applying for the airlines and kind of doing what a lot of people are doing now, everything was aligning itself right. And I've been a guy that has literally tried to get out the Navy at every opportunity afforded me. And then something has kind of popped up. And ultimately, I've just every job. So, this is actually taking a step back, right? I'm a young junior officer in my first squadron. Then you have your junior officers who are all the new people. And then above that, you have your department heads who are kind of middle management. And then you have the executive officer and the CO who are kind of running the squadron. And I remember looking my department heads in the face and being like, I never want your effing job. You guys look miserable, right? And then next thing I know, I'm showing up to a squadron as a department head. And the JOs are like, oh, great, another department head. And I love that job. It was a great job. And I think for me, that tour was a big turning point for me in my career of like actually kind of figuring things out. We talk about this a little later too. Is like, I was a shitty JO, wasn't a good person, wasn't in a good place. A lot of things came to that to change that mindset. And then, fortunately I got selected to command a squadron and loved every minute of it. And I had some challenges, I had some huge challenges, and I loved it. And a lot of times we see people in the military, and the military can be a frustrating place. It's not an easy life. It is a hard life. And you get people that kind of do the like, F this, I can't take this anymore, I'm out of here. Or you can be like, you know what, this is not great, but I want to try and make this better. And I care about the Navy extremely, and I want the Navy to be good. And my mindset was, well, if I want the Navy to be good, I need to stay in and have skin in the game to make the Navy good, right? I didn't want to be the guy that retired at 20 years and then now sit on my porch and drink beer and be like, well, back when I was in the Navy, it was awesome, but
That's a requirement
that's
for
one of
anybody that gets out after that much time.
yeah, but that is one of the things that kind of chaps my hide a little bit, right? Kind of the people that haven't been in a while and aren't going through what I'm going through, right? And just sitting here kind of talking smack about the Navy. And I'm like, no, I want to be in the Navy and I want to make it good. And fortunately, I've got an awesome family that's able to support that. That's selection number one of, hey, can we do this? And that was the big discussion between my wife and I, between retiring or keep going. We're like, no, this is treating us well. We're hanging in, and I want to make the Navy good. I want to stay in. And of course, I can't try and sit there in my squadron and convince all my JOs to try and stay in and keep flying in the Navy if all of a sudden I'm turning around and retiring, right? It's kind of a little bit of that walk in the walk. So I'm like, you know what? No, I think I can be the person. I enjoyed my CO tour. I feel like I was able to make some difference for some people, and I want to kind of keep paying that forward and keep doing it. Very much, I don't want to become. Have you ever heard of the Peter Principle? It's something I gotta keep aware. So the Peter Principle is from the guy Lawrence J. Peter, who was a professor of education in California, and his point was, when you're good at a job, you get promoted. So once you stop getting promoted, that probably means you're not good at that job anymore, right? And what it means is, like, all our organizations, we kind of rise to a level of incompetence, right? Everyone that is operating at a certain job level is operating at their kind of level of incompetence because they were able to do all the jobs really well below that, and that's why they got promoted. And eventually, you peter out. So this is something I kind of keep in the back of my head of like, okay, I think I'm doing okay and doing this job well, but making sure I'm not part of the problem and making things worse. And the reason I chose this pipeline was because this was going to allow me to stay operational, stay working on ships, stay working with sailors, and being able to interact and try and make a difference every day to do something to help, even if it's one sailor, one person, making them enjoy the Navy and making the Navy that much better.
I think that's super admirable, and you hear that from a lot of people who choose to stay in, and I respect that a lot. My question would be, how do you measure that? How do you measure the impact of your change and the things that you're doing? Because more often than not, if you can measure it, it's probably not going to be something that you see.
No, that's always a hard thing to get, because really the true measure, I left my squadron 2 years ago, almost 2 years ago. Really the difference is going to be is how many of those junior officers that I was able to train and mentor stick around for squadron command. And because the problem is, and I'm talking very naval aviation centric, but that's where my experience lies, is we had this kind of run for a while where a lot of junior officers were getting out, and it's because they look at their commanding officers and they're like, doesn't look like CO's having fun. Like, that's not a job I aspire to. I felt like in my squadron, I was kind of, I think my squadron saw that I was enjoying myself, and I had hard decisions to make, but I was able to do it with a smile on my face. And, if now a couple of those, again, even if one of those JOs sticks around for squadron command and can make a difference because they're like, you know what, I saw Farva stick around and do his job, that's where it's going to be, right? So how is it measured? It's not measured in days. It's going to be measured in years. But, even the last week, it's always careful on social media about, I always feel like kind of going down too much of the humble brag route. But like, recently, and it was actually 2 days ago, they just released the new results for the most recent group of aviators that were selected for squadron command. And a couple of my department heads were on that list. And, one reached out to me and said, "Hey, like, I'm here because of kind of the guidance you gave me early on in your career." Like, I mean, that's something that just that comment, right, will keep me going for the next 2 years easily. And I've been fortunate that I've had a couple of those. I had another sailor pretty recently just get commissioned as an ensign and is going to head down to flight school. And I felt, probably a couple conversations, hopefully I had with him outside the jet as I was getting back from flying, helped make a difference. And that it's those little, that's all I need is, those onesie twosies, and seeing those people succeed down the line is what's going to make the difference. How to measure on a day-to-day basis, you can't. But you just have to really go with your gut feeling, like, am I making a difference today? I think I am. I think I've done something. And then keep going with that. And then every once in a while, something will pop up, and that will keep your fire burning for a while.
I think people saying those types of things is absolutely a motivator, and is a great measure. Like you said, even though you may not be able to like check on it every day, it kind of comes back along and throws some gas on the fire, so to speak. You talked about some hard decisions that you had to make at the squadron level as a commanding officer. Seeing you like preparing to go into like that, like kind of on steroids, what kinds of decisions are you worried about making? And maybe what type of leadership philosophy are you looking to bring to the boat?
Well, let's start with that. I think that second part is probably, actually, no, we can talk about that first part. Like, really, there's no decisions I'm worried about making. One, there's a little bit of the secret. As an executive officer, I don't really make decisions, right? That's the commanding officer is the one making the decisions. I'm there to advise him or her and let them know, what I think, and try and go. But, there's a lot of smart people on an aircraft carrier, and it's just leveraging off of each person's expertise. And that's really what I've got to keep in mind. As in a squadron, I had 6 department heads that worked for me as well as the executive officer. So I could be in their chili a little bit more, and on the trust but verify spectrum. I had to be a little bit more in the verify than trust, as they're still learning their job. But on an aircraft carrier, there's a bunch of senior people that have been doing their particular jobs for a long time and know how to do it well. And I've got to swing way more into the trust vice verify, because if I try to verify and micromanage, there's not enough time in a day to do that with that many departments and that many people on an aircraft carrier. And so leveraging off of their expertise, and if they're enforcing a decision that maybe I don't agree with, or recommending a decision, is, hey, let's start pulling the thread about that and having a harder discussion. But for the most part, if they're making a decision, it's probably an informed decision. So as far as like the leadership philosophy, and that's something I'm really still wrapping my head about, because in the squadron with VFA 154, I had 250 sailors and officers, and I knew everyone's name. I knew how to engage with every single person in my squadron. I knew kind of what made them tick. I knew what kind of, for most of them, I probably knew what sports team they liked, that we could talk about whatever happened that last weekend, right? Like, I knew different ways to engage everyone. But again, with 3,500 people, that's going to be a much harder task to get after. But my goal, especially on deployment, was, hey, if I can make, it was kind of the rules of ones. Hey, if I can make one FOD walk down, if I can visit one work center, have one meaningful conversation with a sailor a day, and then spend 15 minutes in the books studying something and making myself better, that was kind of my measure of day. Did I have a successful day? And so I think it's just kind of still keeping that same mindset of getting up from my desk, which is always the easy comfort blanket to be. I can just sit behind a big pile of folders and check emails and do all that kind of stuff. I definitely lead better on my feet, is getting stood up, getting out of my office and going, as you talked about, like, there's a lot of spaces on the carrier, just going to get myself lost. Because if all of a sudden there's a random captain walking around looking lost, that's a good way to get a sailor's attention, and start a conversation. Be like, hey, sir, are you lost? And I'll be like, yes, I am lost. Where am I? And tell me about it. And now I can, start engaging them on what their jobs are, and there's a lot of questions. What icebreakers do I need to have as I'm going around and talking to sailors? Obviously, easy ones. Where are you from? Hey, why'd you join the Navy? What books you're reading. I'll take your feedback. Like what were questions that were asked of you of leaders that got you kind of talking to them easier?
That's a good question. You're putting me on the spot here. I'm supposed to be the one interviewing. Um, I'm not going to be able to think of something specifically, but I will say on the boat, I think that it was extremely encouraging, just the presence of senior leadership in the spaces, because we during that time had a variety of leadership come and go, and not even just at like the top level XO and the CO, but also in the departmental level. Being like at a FOD walk down in the hangar bay or on the flight deck, and your maintenance officer is right there with you, like doing it like that. That's just cool, and you get to like coke and joke for a few minutes, and it kind of removes this invisible boundary that tends to exist in people's head. That's like, oh, you only see so and so at DRB, or at captain's mast. That's like when we see the captain. That wasn't the case for us, but anything that kind of just removes that barrier. And I think it starts with presence. I think that hits the nail on the head. I mean, we'd come down and see several high ranking officers like in the gym with us in the hangar bay, and like that's fun. Did you see XO putting this up on the squat rack, or just coking and joking? That kind of stuff is funny, and kind of builds that rapport.
Yeah, I definitely plan on there's going to be some sort of Liberty chit or something for if anyone can beat my 2K row when I get on the ship. I'm definitely going to be going after. That's one of the ways I lead, right? Is getting in there and getting dirty and doing stuff. But you're right. Like the presence thing is such an important thing, and that was always one of the disheartening things. And I don't feel like I was that great at it. I do have some very introverted parts of me. Like everyone thinks I'm an extrovert, and I can come across that way as a big personality. But walking into a room of people I don't know was hard. And I always tell a story of so when I became in my first squadron as a junior officer, they made me the line division officer, and the line division is where we have all our plane captains. So it's like all your most junior sailors that most of them have only been in the Navy for 6 months. They're brand new. And I think I had probably 40 airmen, and they made me line divo after about, I think I'd only been in the squadron maybe about 9 months. So, it was pretty early on for the division officer tour. And I'm like, all right, I'm the lieutenant. I'm going to walk into the line shack, which is kind of this building that we have just offset from the hangar where they all hang out during the day when they're not launching jets. And I'm like, I'm going to announce my presence line. And I walk in the door, open the door, and it's like, man, if there had been a record playing, you would have heard the record scratch, and like 40 airmen are just staring at me. And it's like, all of a sudden I'm like, don't know what to do. And I just pretty much like jet to the back of the room and go find my chief to, learn this job. Right. It's a skill. That's a skill to learn, how to walk into, you think, yeah, you're the officer. I'm walking into a bunch of junior enlisted. That should be easy. It's not. It's intimidating. And you just have to kind of get to the point where you be comfortable getting in there. And I would sit down and put my feet up and just start kind of asking a couple questions. And man, once you can get one or two people asking questions, it just blows up. And then you can really get good dialogue going. And so even later in my career, as I was a CO walking around, and I had an AT who had just come from another squadron, and I was just doing my kind of daily, popping into their work center on the carrier and checking in with them and chatting with them about stuff. And he was like, "Sir, I have never seen a CO this much in my career." And like in a way that like broke my heart, right? Because that shouldn't be said. I didn't feel like I was doing anything outside the norm, but apparently it was, right? And I was like, this is such an easy thing to do. It literally takes sometimes 5 minutes. Sometimes I would end up spending an hour in there. That's an hour better spent than sitting at my desk doing paperwork. I'll take that any day, right? And that's, again, I think that's going to be my key to success is getting around and walking and doing it and get buy-in too. Because I think with a squadron, as we talk about leadership philosophies, the other part too is like, squadron has a lot less kind of jobs, and I think everyone, it's not that much separation from what their job is to launching an aircraft. Like they can see it on a daily basis of what they're doing and how an aircraft goes off the front end of carrier in a squadron level, because we just don't have that diverse of jobs. But on a carrier right now, we have literally almost every job in the Navy. And actually, it's like, I think the full Navy strength right now is like around 350,000 people, and an aircraft carrier has 3,500 people, right? Like an aircraft carrier has 1% of the total population of the Navy, right? Like that's not an insignificant figure. And you have people, the CSs cooking food. You have, the retail specialists, the ones running the ship's store, right? Cutting hair, like these jobs. And it's getting them to understand that every single job that they do is vital to getting an aircraft off the front end. And you'd be like, well, me cooking food, how does that make a difference? And one, food is a force multiplier. I don't like flying hungry. That's for one. But when I was on the Theodore Roosevelt, as we were in Guam, like one of the things that we were kind of struggling with there for a little bit is we didn't have enough culinary specialists on the carrier to like fully get the kitchens up and running, right? So eliminating, you're like, hey, like this is a pretty good example. But Joe Byerly, who runs the From the Green Notebook blog and podcast, which is a really good, highly recommended listen, especially for anyone that's in the military. But even now, he has a bunch of civilian guests, and he talks about how one of his sergeant majors at his Army command said, "Hey, like you define your distance from what they call the X, right? And the X is where the actual operation happens, and that the meaning is, hey, you need to understand that what your job does supports, that guy kicking in the door being able to do their job." And I'm going to steal from him pretty blatantly and be like, hey, you need to define what your distance from the cat shot is on an aircraft carrier, right? Like you are on this aircraft carrier because that directly affects an aircraft going off the front end with ordnance to do the mission that we've been tasked with.
I had a kind of a strange experience on the boat. We were out to sea and we had the whole air wing out with us. And coming from the boat perspective, we are very disconnected from kind of leadership. And, like you said, there's so many diverse jobs and so many people, it's hard to really kind of connect. And I had several friends that were in one of the helo squadrons that were on board. And we were just kind of like BSing after work. Like they had come down to my shop and we were playing Uno just after work in the little lounge that we had made. And all of a sudden we get this like knock at the door and there's two pilots from their squadron. They're like, "Oh, we heard you guys were playing Uno down here." And I was just like, "Well, come on in, I guess." And that was so cool to see kind of what was available at the squadron level, where that rapport was there. And so it definitely can be done. And I think it's harder to replicate at scale, but I think that it can be done. And even you talked about distance from the X, even from my perspective as working in aviation maintenance, I'm not on the flight deck, but I'm literally repairing an item that's going on to jets every single day. But at the same time, unless I like went out of my way to go up to the flight deck for just like some random reason, you could never see sunlight. If you really wanted to, you could just stay below decks and really kind of just do your part, just show up to work. On deployment, it's tough. Sometimes you got to get into kind of a routine and just like put your head down and like not think too much about your circumstances, but feeling plugged into that mission, it really gives you that sense of accomplishment. And part of my due diligence and research on you, and research meaning a couple quick Google searches mostly, I read an article that you had written about talking about AI replacing pilots in the Navy. Talk to us a little bit about that. What was the goal of the article, and what are your thoughts and feelings about the space?
Yeah, so that article there was some trials a couple years back, and what they were trying to do is it was all kind of through computer simulations of creating a aircraft that was being flown by AI and have it compete against a actual pilot flying this virtual reality and having them engage with each other. And the AI like dominated the competition. And of course, when that kind of came out, everyone was all up in arms. And there's a lot of artificiality that was involved. And I just kind of jumped in and pointed out of some hey, I think here's some things to look at that jumped out at me as I did it. And I was doing this on Twitter, which is kind of the easiest way for me to get my thoughts down, because my brain works at about 280 characters at a snippet before I kind of blind squirrel off in another direction. So I had just kind of thrown some stuff together on Twitter, and then Tyler from the Drive kind of had reached out to me and was like, "Hey, you want to expand on this a little bit?" And really, I was able just to kind of flesh out that article a little bit over the weekend and publish it, it was a great experience. It's probably I have always struggled with writing. It's something I'm terrible at, which is why I try to do it. Is something to get better at. And that was actually a pleasurable experience, because I was writing about something I somewhat was familiar with as well. And there's this huge schism between kind of like the drones taking over and pilots losing their job. Like, we're a far off way from that happening. It's going to be a while before you get on an airline, right? There's no pilots up front flying that. I don't think really the general public is even comfortable with that. That being said, you'd be surprised, like, really how little flying, right, pilots do. Like, autopilot does quite a bit of stuff. And I was a big naysayer, and I think the typical hubris. I actually just got done reading 2 really good books that have in the last couple months that have actually kind of gotten me thinking about this again. First one was Never Mind, We'll Do It Ourselves by Alec Beerbar and this Colonel Mark Cooter, retired. And they were a big part of starting the MQ-9 Predator, or would have been MQ-1 Predators, prior to 9/11, and which were huge. That unmanned system, kind of becoming prevalent in theater. And then the other one was Flying Camelot. I just finished a couple days ago about kind of the development of F-15 and F-16. And the common theme you have with this is, historically, we as aviators are we don't want unmanned platforms, right? Because it's like, hey, that's taking my job. Like, that's what I pride myself on, that I'm in the cockpit, doing this with my wife's scarf flapping in the wind, like the pilots of yore. But hey, we need to get on board with technology and what these systems can bring. And that's kind of how I approached that article. Of, there are some things, AI is definitely not ready for prime time, right? On just throwing an aircraft out there. And I think that's another misconception, right? Every unmanned aerial system, or manned, whatever, drones, whatever terminology we're using, like, there's always a person in the loop still doing something with that system, right? There's very few things that are just out on their own, not operating without any, public, person actually kind of in there operating it as well. And that was kind of my point a little bit with that article, was that, AI, I think, kind of fuse with what a human can do. AI can help me do something quicker. And the best way to really show this is, as I'm, flying around going back to, we talking about G's, that's a high stressful environment, right? And it takes effort for me to get my head moved over to a direction to find the enemy, and using my systems, get my weapons queued onto that aircraft. And then now, even once I have an aircraft locked up to where I could shoot a missile or gun, I now have to come back into my cockpit or look into my joint helmet queuing system and kind of analyze all my parameters, my airspeed, my altitude, the G's I'm pulling, how fast we're crossing, like, just tons of different mathematic kind of things that are going on. Kind of take a snapshot at a time and be like, yes, this is what we would call a valid employment. Like, if I shoot this missile, it's going to have the best chance to intercept the enemy, right? I'm having to do this while I'm pulling G's, yanking my head over my shoulder, and all those kind of things, right? If AI could help me solve that system as I'm fighting, and kind of take the workload off of me to make that decision, I'm still in the cockpit, I'm still pulling the trigger, but now I have this extra kind of layer to help kind of process and calculate all those things. That's a good thing. That's something I want. If that makes me more lethal in the aircraft, makes my job in the aircraft easier, I'm all aboard with it. As a future, as we move into like the loyal wingman is something, as we move into whatever the 6th generation aircraft is going to be, if I now have two little buddies like in the Konami Life Force game I used to play on the Nintendo, whereas I'm flying in my aircraft and I have these two other separate aircraft that are flying with me that I can control and move and expand my airspace and have more missiles to shoot, any of those kind of things. Again, I'm all about that kind of stuff. And getting on board. Yeah. Do I still want to be flying an aircraft? Yeah, because that's how I've defined myself for the last 20 years. One day is my daughter gonna not look at me and be like, you know what, I want to do the same thing my dad did. I would like for her to have that opportunity too, and I think she will. Like, there's gonna be Super Hornets around for quite a bit. The F-35 is gonna be kind of around quite a bit. I think the next aircraft, whatever shape or form it comes into, is still gonna have people flying it a fair amount, and how much we layer that. But yeah, it was kind of just an interesting thought experiment, and then just also kind of explaining some of the artificialities that allowed the AI to kind of dominate that competition, things that we're just not able to do in training. The main one being able to like do a heads-on gunshot. That in a real, if two aircraft flying at each other, pointing their noses at each other, that's how we run into each other, and how unfortunately we've lost aviators in the past. Hence, we've made rules that prevent that from occurring as well. But in that situation, that there was no training rules, and so the AI was able to capitalize on that kind of environment, a lot better than the pilot who was actually kind of flying the VR system was. And that's just kind of also us looking inwards on like, okay, what limits do we have based on how we can train safely, but still kind of maximize us taking shots or weapons envelopes.
Well, and I think a lot of what you're talking about too really points to kind of a lack of education about what AI and like machine learning actually is. We see these movies, iRobot, and like just these very futuristic movies, and people think that represents computers and things like taking over the world. But realistically, what AI and like machine learning is it's code-based rules that are programmed by humans and using past experiences to improve over time. And it's not really the thing thinking for itself. It's just kind of a closed loop improvement system that is based on the past. So yeah, I think that's really interesting. The perception of what that is very misguided, maybe. But that seems to be where the future of the military is going. Some friends of mine that are still on my ship were talking about a UAV shop being put into the boat. And then I don't know a ton about it, but a remote control boat, like a full-size boat being remote controlled. Do you have any thoughts about that? Or
yeah, this is where kind of I'm definitely not the expert. I mean, we're moving towards, there's some thoughts to MQ-25 is going to be a unmanned drone refuel right now, mainly for refueling off the carrier. That's fine. Like, hey, the less that we have to use Super Hornets to tank is always a good thing. And then unmanned ships, right? If I can just have another ship out there with more missiles, always a better thing, right? I can never have too many pieces of ordnance to shoot. I don't know exactly where we're moving with all those. There's definitely some smarter people in the space that are looking into that hard. But hey, I'm all about like, hey, let's think smartly and how we can use these, to maximize the damage we can do.
We're not short of any opportunities to improve. That's for sure. Especially looking at some of the technology that's even used in the Super Hornets, while still very sophisticated. A lot of the stuff that's running it is 80s technology, really. And that is scary to think about, knowing how lethal those things are, and incorporating the idea of how reliable something is over that length of time. Here we are, this far into the future, and still using that type of thing. It kind of bodes well for the future of the military, I think. You talked a little bit earlier about retaining people in the military in general. If we're, let's say, 10, 15 years into the future here and we're working with a much more remote based military, what do you think about military manning as a whole? And this doesn't have to be expressed views or anything, but where do you think that the population requirements for the military is going to be in 10, 15 years? Because we've been on a very I don't know about gradual, but a reduction for a very long time, whether that's forced or not. Maybe just people want to get out. I think that the DoD has recognized that the change in the retirement system to the blended retirement system is very much geared towards people who are not looking to make the military a career. What do you think about that?
So the first thing that usually always comes up right when we start talking about retaining people is always the money piece of, and really just comes down to like, we're never going to be able to pay people enough to match what they get in the civilian life, right? We have to figure out the ways to keep people in, and it's not based on necessarily monetary. Now, we can definitely use monetary to move the needle. That can make the difference for a number of people, but that can't be our only bag that we have or trick that we have in our bag. And so one, it goes back to of like, hey, we want people to want to like to be in the Navy or the military, right? Definitely easier said than done by a far way. And that's goes back to my thought process of like, there are things that are frustrating about being in the military. And that was the nice thing about being a CEO of a squadron is I had a little bit more kind of control, and I could somewhat, protect, maybe a little bit of a strong word, but I could kind of minimize those frustrations, for the people in my squadron, right? So while they at least were in VFA 154, they kind of saw, a better run organization that kind of took care of them, and they're like, okay, hey, this, I can see how this can be done well, and then they can take that in the future. Hopefully, that's me, how I viewed it, and that's the key, right? If everyone is out there trying to make their, the people that they work for, their life better, that makes a difference. Even though as we moved and going back to, even if we move to unmanned systems and all that, we still need the people, and especially in the Navy, like we need people for damage control, right? Even an unmanned ship, there's still going to have to be people that are going to have to get on there and, maintain and work on that ship to keep it running. You can't just put a vessel out to in the ocean for 6 months and expect that thing to be working flawlessly. It ain't going to happen. So we still need people. And I think we've learned that lesson too, is as we try to kind of dial back the manning on sometimes, there is a sweet spot where you can kind of undercut a little bit. And as we're trying to build more ships, and we need to build more ships for a stronger Navy, we're going to need the people to man those ships. There's no getting around that as well. But then after that is like, okay, well, what can we do to improve people's life, away from when they're from the ship, and giving people better education opportunities, giving them some more kind of flexibility or buy-in, or feel like they're part of the process of where they get to live, where they interact, those type of things like that make a difference too. Like there might be a good contingent of people that don't need to be centrally located at this base, or that we can disperse them a little bit more and they can work from home. We've got to really start spreading that net a little bit more and make it flexible, because I think what people get out of the Navy for is they just don't like the bureaucracy of the Navy. Family is always the hugest one. Moving quite a bit has a lot of strain on the family. How do we take care of that? I don't have any of these answers, right? Like I'm always kind of racking my brain as well. And I can only control it at my small level. And that's kind of really where my focus always is in. But there's definitely people always kind of feel like, we're looking hard and we're trying to make changes to change how someone's day-to-day interaction is. Because going back, it's not going to be the money. That's not what's going to keep people in the money in the military. Never is going to be. It's going to be all these other factors that once they add up, that is enough to offset what they are able to go make on the outside.
Yeah. And I think that you're right in saying that it's not the money that's keeping people there, because I think that there is a disconnect in between like a similar type of role, uh like outside of the military, I guess, in terms of like the requirements, like, leaving your family and like all of those things that you can't really put a price on. However, the the salary of the Navy is really not bad by any means. I think when you incorporate all of the benefits that do come from it, granted, not everybody gets to access a lot of things. If you're deployed all the time, you may not be able to access the same education benefits that somebody else is accessing. But like I think that you pointed out, kind of drilling into some of those other features that the military can offer, whether it be TA or maybe some more flexibility with like stationing, location, etc. And I think that the big one too is fostering that sense of, people don't stay in for 20, 30, 40 years because they're like, I don't have anything else to do. They're serving their country. I think that that's the ultimate. And that is something that I think should be fostered to, if the military is thinking about retaining people long term.
Yeah. Shout it from the mountaintop, brother. Like I'm with you on that. Yeah. Again, easier said than done because it can become so, man, you know, you're a leader and you're heading down to your shop and you're like, hey, how much do you love serving your country today? Right. When you're on like month 4 of deployment, looking at the ocean, and it's like, oh, you just get a bunch of eye rolls, right? Like you got to be careful how much you wield that, because it can become like overplayed and everything, right? And it's like, at least, hey, can I figure out how today I can kind of get your buy-in, and then that starts adding up over time, because one of my other kind of little theories I have too, and I try not to use being a parent that much as a metaphor for being, as a leader, but there are some similarities, and I think back of like when you first have a baby, it's rough, right? Like you're up all night, just having to feed and change diapers, and like it is exhausting, and they're hanging out with your baby at 3 a.m. as they're just screaming their head off. You're like, what have I signed up for? But now, as my oldest one is 8, like I have very faint memories of that, right? But I have very crystal clear memories of the times that she has given me a hug and said she loves me, or these like awesome moments with her. And I think the human brain is just wired that way, right? Like we don't remember bad things as crystal clear as we remember good things, because that's how we survive. We've got to be able to forget bad things. That's the only way we can kind of keep moving forward. And like deployment, or your time in the military, I think becomes like that. Of day to day, there was probably some really annoying things on deployment, but those things fade over time. But you remember playing Uno down on the mess decks with some buddies, or that one. I was in Guam and sitting there and getting to actually see the green flash as the sun went down that night. As my entire squad had just promoted, 2 junior officers to lieutenant. We were all hanging out there. It was a beautiful day outside. The sun went down. And I mean, like no doubt that mythical green flash was there. Like that is a moment that is seared in my brain. Those are the things you remember. That's what gets you back. Now all of a sudden, when it's time to sign up, time to do longer, you're like, you got to remember those moments because all this other bad stuff. So if I could minimize the number of bad things that happen to someone, that makes that even easier, and give them those good crystal clear moments. Those are the things that are going to resonate and keep them in for longer as they look back.
I also don't think that it's a coincidence how many of those powerful, strong memories that you associate with the military have people involved. Like you almost never have something that's really like good where it was just you, and that's maybe anecdotal to life. Life is about the relationships, your family, your close friends. But I think that anybody who's gotten out, even if they're the saltiest dog out there, they will probably have a story about a time where one specific person really went out on a limb for them, or did something, and that's what's memorable. So, and that goes back to your comments about leadership and getting involved and all that good stuff. I'm not familiar with this green flash thing though.
You've never heard of the green flash? Oh man.
No, we're not talking the superhero, right?
No, not the DC comic book. So
the Green Lantern, that's the other guy.
Yeah, Green Lantern, right? Yeah. And then there's the Flash. As the sun goes down, and there's the physics of the way the rays move and the spectrum of colors or whatever. But there is, as it's stuff right that last half second as the sun is going below the horizon, you can sometimes see, and it's better seen on the ocean, right? Because of the way the light rays move, but you'll get all of a sudden this green flash, and it's one of those things people tell you, and it's almost like one of those things that someone's playing a joke on you, right? You're like, hey, just stand out there and watch the sunset. You'll see a green flash, and you'll stand out there day after day after day, and you're like, now I look like an idiot because I'm just going up here all this time. But I would say that day, I mean, it was like a lighthouse of green light. It was so bright, and I mean, we all were standing there, and we were even like, this is the day, and I mean, it was it was amazing.
This isn't something particular to Guam or
No, I think you can see it anywhere. I'd have to get on the Google machine. It said it's best seen though on the ocean, because I think the way the light rays refract. I'm definitely getting way over my skis in the physics of light's refraction here, but I think that's part of it. So check it out. Next time you're on the boat on the water and sunset, look for the green flash. Not saying it's also going to happen every day. It's got to also be clear day and all this, bunch of other phenomenon to have.
This might be worth one more enlistment at this rate. This sounds cool. I've watched a lot of sunsets.
Or just get your own boat. You can never, and then
that too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But the best boat is someone else's boat, is what I've been told.
Yeah, I've heard that. This is cool. I've never even seen or heard of this, so I'll need to look into that and do some reading. I want to talk a little bit about your extracurriculars. I've mentioned a couple of the things that you had written about, but you're published. You've got articles written scattered all around the internet about you writing and kind of sharing your thoughts. You've talked about being active on Twitter and kind of sharing your opinions there. According to your LinkedIn, that was also another part of my research. You're a co-owner of Board and Brush. Maybe not currently. Is that?
Yeah,
is that up to date?
No, so that was a former Board and Brush. So Board and Brush is actually a franchise, and it was a business my wife and I started when we were stationed in my last duty station in Lemoore, when I was the XO and the CO. And so Board and Brush, it's a company based out of Wisconsin, and it's kind of the paint and sip model, where you go a date night or a girls' night out. You go to this place and you either paint a picture. We made wood signs, so you'd make a wood sign, stencil it, paint it, and while you're doing it, you're drinking a beer. You hang out for 3 hours. It's kind of something to do. And so my wife and I had gone on a date night together in Reno before we moved down to California, and had checked this place out. And my wife, and this kind of can wrap into some of our earlier conversations. My wife was, she was a high performing individual before she became a military spouse, right? And we used to work on campaigns. She was actually in between working on a presidential campaign when we met, when we started dating. We long distance dated as she was getting her master's in San Francisco while I was stationed in Fallon. Was driving back and forth to, and so, she has a desire to want to serve, and also, be a part of the community, as kind of the small town girl she is. And we were looking, so we came back from that, and she's like, I think this would be really great in downtown Hanford, which is the town right next to Lemoore. And for people who have been to Hanford, it's actually really cool. It's in the Central Valley. This kind of got a cool old, 50s vibe to it in the downtown area. It's got the big, nice kind of grassy area and stuff. But the downtown, there's just not a whole lot to do. It's kind of a lot of the businesses that closed down or anything. And my wife was like, hey, I want to be able to do something while you're at work as well, right? She just didn't want to stay at home, which is completely reasonable. And going back to, as we're talking about, a way to try and keep people in the military, being able to keep spouses employed and have them have opportunities. And that is something that is definitely being talked about on, as we've changed tax laws. talked about, their certifications transfer, like, the federal government is doing things to help enable that. Again, I'm not fully smart on it, but that is probably one of the other biggest reasons people get out of the military, right? Is because their spouse's job becomes a priority over the military members job, and sometimes those two aren't compatible, and that's just something we got to kind of really keep working hard at. And it worked out, as we were moving down to Hanford. As I said, I was planning on retire, so we are like, all right, well, hey, let's start this business, and then I'm going to retire, and we can kind of live here for a couple more years as we kind of figure out where we actually want to plant roots one day. And so we applied for the franchise and got accepted, and opened it kind of prior to me actually showing up to the squadron. And it worked out. I had kind of a little bit of training time in between where I was almost a full-time carpenter for a couple months as we were like building out our space and putting it together. And it was a great experience, other than, the bureaucracy of trying to start a small business in California. It was great. And what was awesome is, like, my wife became pretty popular in the community because she brought this like business to the downtown area. It was something for people to go do. And people were always constantly thanking her on, like, thanks for bringing this to like downtown Hanford, right? Like, this is part of this, like, us trying to revitalize and bring something to the local economy. And that was a really cool experience, and valuable, I think, and allowed us to do something. When we started it, and I'm about to start my, XO and CO tours, which I knew I was going to be deploying. I knew we were going to be busy. We had 2 kids at home. At the time when we first moved there, they were 5 and 2, right? So we had 2 little ones at home, and we luckily had a pretty good support network of friends and family around the area that we'd known, and that helped kind of alleviate the strain. But when we started it, we were like, we're going to look back at this time a couple of years from now, and we're going to be like, we are batshit crazy for trying to do this. And there were definitely some stressful moments to do it, but that's part of being married, and we're both like to get out of our comfort zone, and we acknowledge that about each other, and one of those things that helped definitely made our marriage stronger and allowed her to do something. And then that was part of the conversation. And of course, kind of COVID happened, and that really threw a curveball into opening a business, especially one that serves alcohol, and where people gather in a small place, right? And I was on deployment as all this is going on. So again, God bless my wife, right? She's dealing with 2 kids, COVID, unknowns of that. I'm in deployment in, living in a hotel room in Guam, also not know what's going on, and balance and all that, right? There were stressful times. And that was also about the time we kind of made the decision that kind of the pendulum was swinging the other way, and like, hey, we're going to prioritize my career again and allow me to pursue this opportunity that the Navy's presenting me with to go on the nuke pipeline. And so, we ultimately sold the business. It's still open and thriving there in Hanford to do it. And so my wife's, she's eager. She's always, now that we're here on the East Coast, she's kind of trying to figure out what her next step is. And I sympathize with the spouses of military members. It's not easy, and how much they have to sacrifice and give up so that I can have a successful career. And I'm thankful. I will tell people that is the only reason I am in the Navy today, is because of the amazing support that she has given me. My daughters are hanging in there. They're young enough. I think them growing up in a military lifestyle, as for lack of a better word, as a military brat, it's going to be better for them in the long run. It's going to strengthen their abilities and pave the road, get ready the child for the road and not the road for the child, kind of thing. We're making some hard decisions, and as it's something that we are constantly reassessing. So if in a couple of years, hey, my family says, hey, we can't hack this anymore, I'm done. But right now we're hacking it and thriving as well. So the business was a great experience and taught us a lot, especially about tax rules and liquor license rules in California. I learned way more about that than I ever thought I would.
Highlight something incredibly important if you're going to have any kind of longevity in the military is you really got to have the home front taken care of and everybody on the same page and kind of fighting for the same thing, because you can easily get twisted around and The military demands a lot of you. It really does.
Yeah. Whenever I have someone, when I'm talking to a sailor or an officer and they're talking about getting out, and if their number one reason is like, I'm like, hey, because I always ask people, right? Like, you want to have that conversation, like, hey, why are you getting out? Hey, like, my family, we just don't want to do this anymore. And like, pretty much from then on, like, I shut up. Like, there's no, I'm not even going to try and convince you, like, because that's the number one thing. The young sailor who's like, F this, I don't know, I'm just going to move back home and find a job. I'm like, hey, let's talk about things. Let's figure out a plan for you. But yeah, whenever someone makes a decision for family, like and that's one of my pet peeves, is people who kind of shit on someone who's getting out because their family couldn't hack it. And I'm like, hey man, everyone's situation is different. And I said, I have been extremely blessed with how awesome my wife has been, and she blooms where she is planted. I have dragged her to some not the most desirable of locations, and she thrives everywhere she goes. So, and she drags me out of the house. If when we were in Japan, I was tired on Friday coming back after our hard week in the office, and I just wanted to lay on the couch. And she's like, no, we're in Japan. We're getting out of the house and we're going to go travel. And, and it was always a good thing that she did that. Because if not, I would have just sat on the couch and watched TV all weekend and then gone back to my job on Monday and never actually seen Japan. So I'm thankful for her for that.
I bring up the board and brush thing in kind of context of, we're talking a lot about retention in this conversation and keeping people in, and or at least getting people to what they're designed to be doing. I think that one of the most critical things to that we haven't talked about yet is getting people engaged in stuff that they like to do outside the military. I'm not sure what it is, and I've mentioned this on several prior podcasts, but for some reason I felt like there was a magnificent burden and something that kept me from doing the stuff that I like to do while I was in the Navy. I can't do that. I'm in, and like, I can't wait to get out so I can like do what I want to do. And like, a part of that, I didn't even know what I wanted to do. So that was the first part of the problem. But I think that there's a larger lesson there around your life not actually being on hold because you're in the military. And I think that you represent that very well, and like taking on, you're writing, you're like starting a business. What would your best advice be for people that are kind of like looking for that fulfillment outside the military, or like finding activities and stuff to fulfill them that are outside of their job?
Yeah. So first, it took me a long time to get to the point I'm at. And I said, I was a shithead in my 20s and did not spend my time right. A couple different stories. So the first one, I did almost a year in Afghanistan on what we call an individual augmentee. So I got kind of, after my junior officer tour, I signed up to go kind of work for the Air Force for a year. And that was a huge kind of turning point in my career. And, it was one of these that we were in the aircraft on this like 5-hour mission, nothing's going on. I'm talking to the pilots, and I was like, yeah, I just been stationed in Lemoore. And they're like, oh yeah, you're like near the Sequoias, and you got Yosemite, that's like an hour and a half drive away. And I had been in Lemoore for like 4 years prior to that. And I was like, and it hit me, I was like, you know what? And I never went to either one of those places in that 4 years, right? Because I was just too busy probably drinking on the couch, hanging out with my buddies, wasting my time, and that was a pretty big, I think, mindset shift for me. So when I got back from Afghanistan and I was back in Lemoore for a couple months, just getting recurrent on the F-18 before I moved up to Fallon, like, it was like one morning I was hanging out on my couch with my buddy, and it was a beautiful day outside, and we're just sitting there watching NCIS or whatever bullshit, whatever was on TV. And I was like, dude, let's go on a hike. And he's like, yeah, let's do it. And we got in the car and drove to the Sequoias, which is literally an hour, not even almost an hour, hour drive, and went on this awesome hike. And, it was like on my front doorstep. Right. So it's kind of taking advantages of that. I think so there's this movie called Sideways, and it's about these two guys who go on this like trip to the wine country. And he's telling the story. He's got this, he's usually was it Paul Giamatti, who's kind of the character, huge wine snob, like super smart at wine. He's talking to his love interest, and they're talking about this like great bottle of wine he has, and he's talking about how he's like, I'm waiting for the special occasion to drink that bottle of wine. And the woman's like, when you drink that bottle of wine, that is the special occasion, right? Like that is the moment. And the movie ends with him like drinking it out of a styrofoam cup at a Popeyes, right? Like enjoying that wine. And I always kind of use that too, of don't wait for that right moment to have, right? Like having kids, all these kind of stuff, like there's never going to be a right moment. Like you just got to jump in and do it and find whatever you like and go after it. Now, here's where I'll kind of caveat that, right? And I think you hit on with the military of, I want my people in my squadron, I want them to have a life outside the military, because that's what makes us grow, right? If you work all day, that's going to burn you out. Like you need to have a hobby outside of that. And if you're interested in finance, investing, woodworking, working on cars, whatever that kind of stuff is, go after it, do that. Problem is like, okay, if that starts taking away from your ability to do your job when you're at work, we need to have some hard conversations where your priorities are, right? Like I need you to be in the focus on the job with your mind there doing the work, not kind of just biding your time in my squadron while you're kind of getting this other thing going. And, when we started Board and Brush, like I said, I had some time kind of before I started in the squadron that I could help out my wife, as co-owners, building it out, getting it started. But once I kind of got really into my XO job, I had a stiff, we had that conversation. I'm like, hey, like, I'm not going to be able to help with you because my focus is being the executive officer of the squadron. We had that discussion, and that made that difference. But, all the other stuff I do, it seems like a lot, but it's so spread out that, it's more of like, every day I'm trying to make myself better. It's really comes down to, right? Like, what am I doing today to make myself a better version of myself than I was yesterday? Working out for me has always been a huge part of that. That's the best way for me to relieve stress. Do something is get in the gym, throwing around heavy weight or pulling on a rower. Twitter has been a great way to kind of, for me to like, just kind of throw things against the wall and see what stick. That's what I've loved about Twitter, is it's a way to just interact with people and flesh out, my conversations. Like, me having this conversation with you, which is, we were able to set up via Twitter, has allowed me to just kind of verbalize my thoughts that maybe I haven't had time to really sit down and have the introspection to do, right? Like all those kind of moments help out. And then every once in a while, like, hey, there's this something that's passionate about, like, writing this article or something that all of a sudden kind of comes to me. That being said, I've got like 3 in the hopper that are just staring at me in the face that I can't get through, that I want to write these articles, but I'm so terrible at writing in them that now it's just like this stress of like, oh, you're not succeeding today because you didn't write those articles. And there, there's people that are way more prolific than I am as well. And all mine have been pretty close to the pin on what I do on a daily basis with my job anyway. So it's not that huge of a stress. So, to really answer your question is like, you just need to get in there and do it. There's never going to be a right time. If you wait for the right time, next thing you know, it's passed you by.
I think that hits the nail on the head. It's really hard to internalize that while you're in. I know, looking back on my time there, it's the farthest thing from a waste, but because I learned so much and my experience was so positive in hindsight, but in terms of my own personal and professional development outside of the military, I wasted 4 years not working on and pursuing the things that I found interest in because of something invisible that didn't actually exist. So I think that you're right. There isn't a right time.
Yeah. And when people ask me about my time at the Naval Academy, I wasted 4 years. Like, I got an education and ultimately I became a Naval Aviator, which was my goal. But like, I slept most of the day. I went to class, slept, got up, went to the gym, worked out, and went back to bed. Right. Like I wasn't an avid reader. I wasn't involved in really any sports. I was kind of in a weird mental state. I had some mental depression struggles a little bit, but part of that was probably me not working as hard as I could have while I was there. And I really look back at my time at the Naval Academy. It's like, man, I had some great opportunities there, and I just flushed them away because I didn't take that chance. And that's one of those things that now kind of always in the back of my head of like, make your day worth it. Make your day worth it. Hey, I love a nap in the middle of the day, and I still do it all the time because sleep is important. Rest is that's where we grow. It's not in the gym when your muscles grow. It's not while you're awake that your brain grows. It's while you're sleeping, right? So I do love me some rest as well, but it's trying to take advantage of those snippets of time when I've got them.
I want to close out here with two more questions. The first is, do you have any heroes?
No, I don't. I look at, and the way to do this is I think I so many snippets of everyone, right? Like you hear the old axiom of like, you kind of see bad things and you good things and you put those all in your toolbox. And I am definitely an amalgamation of like everyone I've ever worked with. And, I've had some bad leaders and I've had some good leaders. And I've taken snippets out of that. In some ways, I will tell you, my life as a CO in some ways was almost a lot of things I did in a CO was like very counter to what my previous COs had done. Right. Because I think that resonated with me a little bit more, but no, I kind of look at everyone with kind of I'm trying to think of the eye, like kind of a cynical eye, right? Like I think everyone's got their good sides and their bad sides. And, a lot of also talk about, it always goes back to me of, I have messed up a lot of my stuff in my career. And I try to be very, on Twitter. It's one of the things I really liked about Twitter, right? Is I can kind of like air like, hey, I don't have all this stuff figured out. There's a lot of things I've screwed up. And even though I've screwed these things up, I'm able to move on from that and learn from that. Right. And that's what I'm trying to like, I really promote the like not fear of failure as well. So, I like those kind of stories, but there's definitely not a certain person I kind of like point at and be like, that's the person I want to be like. I am a composite of so many different people and parts that I wouldn't even know where to begin.
Fair enough. That's a good answer. You've mentioned reading a couple times. What are you reading right now?
So I actually just finished up reading, I said Flying Camelot by Michael Hankins. I try and kind of bounce between fiction and nonfiction as much as I like nonfiction. Sometimes there's like, man, I just need something I can just sit down and like zone out for a while. So actually the other one I just got into is the Independency series by John Scalzi. Finished that up while I was on the carrier for 30 days. I actually got through quite a few books with that. So that was actually been quite an enjoyable read. I do like my sci-fi. So I think reading fiction is just as important as reading to nonfiction.
I really need to take that to heart because I really thrust myself into just all sorts of like dry business books, and I need an escape sometimes. So
yeah, and reading should be an enjoyable experience. Even sometimes reading a business book is enjoyable, right? Reading, I do like to read a lot of biographies. I'm not like a leadership book guy. Like when people ask me like, what leadership books do you read? I'm like, I don't like those kind of books. They don't really resonate with me. But I like reading biographies again to see how people have failed and how people have succeeded. I think those are usually a little bit more informative as well. But man, like I'm still actually making my way through Ron Chenro's biography of Grant, which is a great book, but man, it is dense. And I can do a chapter or two every night. But if that's all I'm reading every night, it's like no. So I need something where it's some sort of sci-fi or some other fiction book or just something easy to read that keeps me good. Yeah, because that the other actually book, the one book that has that I kind of pick up pretty regular now. I know it's probably all the rage, but I have kind of taken into like kind of the Stoic philosophy a little bit more, and Marcus Aurelius, reading Meditations. That I was going through that, reading through that while I was in my command tour, and that really hit some things for me and was almost in a way like a warm blanket to pull over that I was like, man, I think this is this thing that I've been looking for so long. Like, I'm not a big guy into faith, and I don't have any of those kind of things that drive me. But like, all of a sudden, it was like, hey, this kind of snapped into my brain, and that's a book that I still pick up pretty regularly as well. But again, it's like something you can read in small little snippets before you get bogged down into it.
That's a must read, a personal favorite, and never heard it described as a warm blanket, because sometimes it feels like quite the opposite when you're reading it. But yeah, that's interesting. If you're a biography fan, I also very dense and kind of hard to take in a lot at once, but I would definitely recommend Walter Isaacson's Steve Jobs biography.
Oh, yeah.
Very, very good.
All right, check it out.
Colin,
it's my ever-growing stack of books that I'm losing time to read for this last couple months has been really nice because I haven't been in school a whole lot, but my schedule is going to get busy here in the next couple of weeks. So I think that's the other part. When you're in school all day, the last thing, sometimes you just want to come home and watch Seinfeld episodes on Netflix, and there's nothing wrong with that, right? Like, and that's the other part too, is like, don't beat yourself up because you didn't read a book, because of course you get on social media and this person's like, I read 154 books last year, and you're like, man, I'm a slacker. But don't compare yourself to the people on the internet. It never works out well, right? Like, what do I read? But this last month has actually been a pretty prolific reading environment for me, which has been nice.
Colin, this has been fantastic. Thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, Brock, thanks for reaching out. It's good discussion, man. Best of luck to you.
Thanks so much for tuning in today. Your listenership helps me better educate people like you and the rest of our nation's military, both past and present, on building a successful life outside of military service. If you're looking for more ways the top vets are leading more effective lifestyles, building businesses, and using the resources designed specifically for you, press here for a selection of some of the best clips. Be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel to stay up to date, and I will be talking with you soon.